The morning sun rose slowly above the golden sands, spreading soft light over the wide waters of the Nile. In the royal palace, the pharaoh would awaken to the quiet songs of birds and the gentle hum of the river beyond the palace walls. His chambers were filled with cool air drifting through carved stone windows, carrying the scent of lotus flowers placed carefully in clay jars by servants before dawn. The pharaoh's day began not with haste, but with ritual. A basin of pure water, drawn from the Nile at sunrise, was placed before him. Washing his face and hands was not only a matter of cleanliness, it was a sacred act, connecting him to the gods who gave life to the river and the land. Priests whispered prayers in the background, their voices calm and low, weaving blessings into the stillness of the morning. In these quiet hours, the pharaoh was both a man and a divine figure. To his people, he was chosen by the gods, the bridge between heaven and earth. Yet as he dressed in soft linen robes woven finely by the palace women, he was also a human being preparing for the day's duties, eating, deciding, listening, and guiding. As the golden sun climbed higher, the palace slowly awakened. Servants carried trays of bread, figs, and honeyed dates. Musicians practiced on harps and flutes, their notes floating gently through the halls. Outside, the city of Memphis stirred with life, farmers making their way to the fields, fishermen setting out on boats, and scribes preparing their scrolls. The day had begun, and with it, the pharaoh stepped into his role once again, both ruler and servant of the gods.
The pharaoh's breakfast was never hurried. It was a quiet moment, shared with family or trusted companions, away from the weight of politics and ceremony. A low table was prepared, covered with dishes of warm bread baked from emmer wheat, bowls of figs and grapes, and jars of fresh milk. Honey, golden and thick, gleamed in small clay pots, ready to sweeten the simple meal. Servants moved with silence, their steps measured, their gestures graceful. The pharaoh's cup was filled with cool water, drawn from wells close to the Nile, clear and refreshing in the desert heat. Sometimes he chose beer, a thick, nourishing drink that even nobles enjoyed as part of their daily life. This meal was not about luxury, it was about balance. Food was considered a gift of the gods, and every bite was taken with quiet gratitude. Before eating, the pharaoh often offered a small portion to the household shrine, placing a piece of bread or a drop of honey as an offering to the spirits and deities who guarded the palace. Around him, family members spoke softly. They shared dreams from the night, omens noticed in the stars, or news from the temple priests. These moments of calm connected the pharaoh not only to his gods, but to his loved ones, grounding him before the heavy affairs of the kingdom began. Outside, the city grew louder, the cries of market sellers, the sound of hooves, and the call of fishermen on the river. Yet inside the palace walls, the pharaoh's morning remained serene, a fragile bubble of peace before the day demanded his judgment and strength.
After his morning meal, the pharaoh often walked through the grand halls of his palace. The floors were polished stone, cool beneath his sandals, and the walls were painted with bright scenes of battles, ceremonies, and offerings to the gods. Columns rose high, carved with lotus flowers and papyrus, symbols of life and rebirth. Servants and guards bowed as he passed, their eyes lowered, their bodies still. To them, his presence was more than human, it was divine. Yet the pharaoh walked calmly, sometimes pausing to speak with an attendant, sometimes lifting his gaze to admire the murals that told the story of Egypt's past. The palace itself was a city within a city. Courtyards bloomed with palm trees and fragrant flowers, pools of clear water reflecting the sky. Birds sang from shaded gardens, while cats wandered freely, their sleek bodies considered sacred protectors of the home. In one chamber, scribes worked quietly, bent over scrolls of papyrus, their reed pens scratching softly as they recorded the affairs of the state. In another, artisans carved statues and jewelry, crafting gifts for the gods or tributes for visiting nobles. Every corner of the palace was alive, each person playing a role in maintaining the rhythm of royal life. For the pharaoh, this walk was not just a tour of his home, it was a reminder of his duty. Each face he saw, each bowed head, each worker's hand reminded him that Egypt looked to him for order and prosperity. And as he stepped into the heart of the palace, where the great hall awaited, he prepared to face the voices of his kingdom.
The great hall of the palace was vast, its high ceiling supported by rows of painted columns, each one a story in stone. Light filtered in through narrow openings, casting soft beams across the polished floor where courtiers and officials gathered. This was where the pharaoh would sit upon his throne, a golden chair adorned with the image of the falcon god Horus, symbol of kingship. Petitions were brought forward, farmers seeking relief from a failed harvest, merchants asking permission for trade, generals reporting on the borders, all came with heads bowed low. The pharaoh listened in silence, his face calm, his eyes steady. When he spoke, his words were deliberate, flowing with the rhythm of authority, but never rushed. Each judgment carried weight, shaping the lives of thousands. Behind him, priests stood ready to remind him of omens and divine law. Their voices whispered guidance, connecting every decision to the god's will. For the people, the pharaoh was not simply making choices, he was channeling divine wisdom. At times, musicians played softly in the background, their harps weaving gentle notes into the air, reminding all that even in duty, harmony must be kept. The pharaoh's gestures were small but powerful, a nod of approval, a raised hand for silence, a gaze that could lift or crush a petitioner's hopes. Though the throne was heavy with expectation, the pharaoh bore it with serenity. To him, ruling was not only power, it was responsibility. And as the morning stretched into midday, he carried the burdens of his people, weaving justice into the heart of the kingdom. When the duties of judgment were complete, the pharaoh often turned his steps toward the temples. A procession followed, priests carrying incense, guards with spears gleaming in the sun, and musicians whose drums kept a steady rhythm. The people lined the streets, bowing deeply as the living God passed among them. The temple stood tall, its pylons carved with scenes of battles and offerings, painted in bright colors that glowed under the desert sun. Before entering, the pharaoh paused, offering gifts of gold, oils, and flowers. The air grew heavy with incense, sweet and smoky, rising like prayers toward the heavens. Inside, shadows fell across towering columns, and the cool stone carried the echo of every step. Priests in white linen led the pharaoh toward the sanctuary, the most sacred part of the temple, hidden from common eyes. Here, a statue of the god rested within a shrine, adorned with jewels and cloth. The pharaoh alone was allowed to approach. He bowed, spoke softly, and placed offerings before the god. To his people, this act was more than ritual, it was renewal. By feeding and honoring the gods, the pharaoh ensured the Nile would flood, crops would grow and harmony would remain. When he emerged again, sunlight wrapped around him and the people cheered. To them, the ceremony was proof that their ruler was not only human, but a divine bridge, walking between the seen and unseen worlds.
After the temple rites, the pharaoh often returned to the palace for a time of rest. The heat of midday was strong, and even kings were not untouched by the desert sun. In shaded courtyards, cooled by pools of water and palm trees, he would recline on a low couch, attended by servants who fanned the air with woven palm leaves. A meal was brought, light but refreshing. Bread flavored with herbs, fresh cucumbers, melons, and cooled wine mixed with water. Musicians played gently, their melodies soft as a breeze, while dancers moved gracefully in the background. Sometimes the pharaoh listened to stories told by skilled narrators, tales of gods, ancient battles, and wise kings of the past. At other times, he sat in silence, gazing at the reflection of the sky in the pool before him, letting his thoughts drift like lotus blossoms on water. This pause was more than leisure, it was balance. In the philosophy of Egypt, life demanded harmony between work and rest, action and reflection. Just as the Nile had its flooding and retreat, so too did the pharaoh's day have its rhythm of movement and stillness. When the sun began to lower and the heat softened, the pharaoh rose again. His mind was refreshed, his spirit calmed. The afternoon awaited, filled with the voices of scholars, generals, and builders. Egypt was vast, and its ruler had much to oversee. Yet, for this brief hour, peace had been his companion. As the sun slid westward, casting long shadows across the palace, the pharaoh gathered with his council. This was not the grand hall of petitions, but his smaller chamber, reserved for trusted advisors, generals, priests, and scribes. Here words could flow more freely, and plans could be shaped with care. Maps were spread across wooden tables, papyrus scrolls marked with borders, rivers, and trade routes. Scribes stood ready, their pens poised to capture each decision. Generals spoke of fortresses along the deserts, merchants of caravans bringing gold and incense, priests of omens read in the stars. The pharaoh listened, his gaze moving slowly across the faces of his advisors. He asked questions, weighed answers, and sometimes sat in silence, letting the voices of others blend before he spoke. His decisions were measured, rooted not in haste, but in balance. This council was the heart of Egypt's stability. Here the kingdom's future was shaped, canals to water the fields, temples to honor the gods, walls to guard the frontiers. Each choice carried ripples, touching farmers, craftsmen, traders, and soldiers alike. Though power rested in his hands, the pharaoh knew he was part of something larger, the eternal rhythm of Ma'at, the principle of order and harmony. To break it was to invite chaos. To uphold it was to ensure Egypt's prosperity. As the council ended, the advisors bowed deeply. The pharaoh rose, his figure framed by fading sunlight. Outside, the Nile shimmered, eternal and unchanging. And within him, the weight of destiny settled once more.
In the late afternoon, the pharaoh often welcomed scholars and scribes into his presence. These men were the keepers of knowledge, their hands stained with ink from reed pens, their minds filled with wisdom drawn from the stars, the river, and the sacred texts. Scrolls of papyrus were unrolled, their surfaces covered with lines of hieroglyphs, symbols as old as time itself. Scribes read aloud records of taxes collected, grain stored, and decrees carried out. They spoke in calm voices, steady and precise. For each word was a matter of permanence. What they wrote would echo through generations. Sometimes astronomers came forward, describing the movement of the stars across the night sky. They pointed to patterns and cycles, predicting floods, eclipses, and sacred days. To the pharaoh, these were not idle observations, but vital truths, for Egypt's survival depended on knowing when the Nile would rise and when it would fall. The pharaoh valued these gatherings deeply. Though his role was divine, he relied on the wisdom of men who studied the world with patience. He asked questions, listened intently, and sometimes spoke of his own dreams, which the priests interpreted as messages from the gods. Knowledge was power, and power was stability. Through the hands of the scribes, the pharaoh's will was carved into eternity. And through the minds of the scholars, his kingdom walked in harmony with the heavens.
As the day stretched into its golden hours, the pharaoh often visited the builders who shaped Egypt's future. Massive stones rose under the hands of laborers, pulled on sledges, lifted with ropes, and set carefully into place. Dust shimmered in the air, and the sound of hammers echoed like the heartbeat of the land. The pharaoh's presence among them was not common, but when he came, it was a moment of awe. Workers paused, bowing deeply, their bodies covered with sweat and dust. To them, he was the reason for their labor, the living God whose monuments would stand for eternity. Architects spread their plans, straight lines, perfect angles, sacred proportions. They spoke of temples rising to honor Amun, or tombs being carved deep within the Valley of the Kings. Every structure was more than stone. It was a prayer, a bridge to the afterlife. The pharaoh listened, offering guidance, approving designs, sometimes suggesting inscriptions that would tell future generations of Egypt's glory. He walked among the workers, his steps firm but calm, knowing that the sweat of today was the immortality of tomorrow. The sun glowed red against the horizon, and the stones cast long shadows. Egypt was being built, piece by piece, not only for the living, but for the gods and the dead. And the pharaoh, in silence, watched his eternity take shape before his eyes. When the work of the day drew to a close, the pharaoh often sought the quiet of the Nile's banks. The river shimmered in the soft light of sunset, its waters carrying the reflection of a sky painted with gold and crimson. Boats drifted slowly, their sails catching the last breath of the day's wind. Here, the pharaoh walked with only a few companions. He breathed deeply, the scent of wet earth and lotus flowers filling the air. Fishermen waved respectfully from their boats, and farmers returning from the fields bowed as they passed. The Nile was more than water, it was life. It gave grain, fish, transport, and trade. Without it, Egypt would wither beneath the desert sun. To the pharaoh, every ripple on its surface was sacred, every wave a reminder of the god's blessing. Sometimes he stepped into a royal barge, its deck lined with cushions,
its sail painted with sacred symbols. Musicians played soft melodies as the boat glided gently downstream. The rhythm of the oars, dipping and lifting, was like a heartbeat, steady and soothing. As darkness fell, torches were lit along the banks. The Pharaoh leaned back, watching the stars awaken in the night sky. For a moment, the weight of kingship eased, and he became simply a man listening to the whispers of the river.
When the work of the day drew to a close, the Pharaoh often sought the quiet of the Nile's banks. The river shimmered in the soft light of sunset, its waters carrying the reflection of a sky painted with gold and crimson. Boats drifted slowly, their sails catching the last breath of the day's wind. Here the Pharaoh walked with only a few companions. He breathed deeply, the scent of wet earth and lotus flowers filling the air. Fishermen waved respectfully from their boats, and farmers returning from the fields bowed as they passed. The Nile was more than water. It was life. It gave grain, fish, transport, and trade. Without it, Egypt would wither beneath the desert sun. To the Pharaoh, every ripple on its surface was sacred, every wave a reminder of the god's blessing. Sometimes he stepped into a royal barge, its deck lined with cushions, its sail painted with sacred symbols. Musicians played soft melodies as the boat glided gently downstream. The rhythm of the oars dipping and lifting was like a heartbeat, steady and soothing. As darkness fell, torches were lit along the banks. The Pharaoh leaned back, watching the stars awaken in the night sky. For a moment, the weight of kingship eased, and he became simply a man, listening to the whispers of the river.
When night approached, the palace often filled with the sounds of laughter, music, and the clinking of cups. Feasts were not held every day, but when they came, they were celebrations of abundance and joy. Tables were laid with roasted duck, fresh fish from the Nile, lentils, bread, dates, and figs. Jars of wine and beer were poured generously, their rich scent filling the air. Servants moved gracefully between the guests, ensuring no plate or cup remained empty. The Pharaoh sat at the head of the feast, surrounded by nobles, generals, and family. Conversation flowed easily. Tales of distant lands, victories of the past, and dreams for the future. Laughter echoed beneath painted ceilings, where scenes of gods and stars looked down upon the living. Dancers moved in rhythm, their bodies life, their jewelry glimmering in the torchlight. Harps and flutes played, weaving melodies that seemed to float through the air like silk. Cats prowled between the tables, their golden eyes catching the light, symbols of grace and divine protection. The feast was not only for pleasure, it was a reminder of Egypt's prosperity. Each bite, each sip, was proof of the Nile's blessing and the Pharaoh's ability to maintain harmony. As the night deepened, torches flickered and the music softened. The Pharaoh raised his cup, offering thanks to the gods and to his people. And in that moment, surrounded by joy, Egypt felt eternal. When the feasts and duties were complete, the Pharaoh withdrew to his private chambers. These rooms, though richly decorated, were quiet sanctuaries, far from the noise of the palace halls. Painted walls showed scenes of lotus flowers, rivers, and gods protecting the sleeping king. Servants prepared his bed, laying fine linen sheets and perfuming the air with myrrh and incense. Lamps flickered softly, casting golden light across the chamber. Before lying down, the pharaoh performed a ritual of purification, washing once more with sacred water and whispering prayers to the gods of the night. Dreams in Egypt were more than illusions. They were messages from the divine, glimpses into hidden truths. Priests often interpreted the pharaoh's dreams, guiding decisions with their meanings. Thus, sleep was sacred, a journey into the unseen. The pharaoh lay down, his mind heavy with the day, yet calm with the rhythm of ritual. Outside, the city quieted. The Nile flowed endlessly, whispering against its banks. Stars glimmered above, guardians of the eternal sky. In the stillness, the pharaoh closed his eyes. The weight of his crown was set aside, and for a few hours he belonged not to the kingdom, but to his dreams.
As the pharaoh slept in his chamber, the city beyond the palace walls awakened once more. Farmers moved toward their fields, carrying tools worn smooth by generations of hands. Bakers lit their ovens, filling the streets with the warm scent of bread. Fishermen pushed their boats into the river, their nets ready to gather the Nile's gift. The pharaoh's life was far removed from theirs, yet deeply connected. Their labor filled the storerooms of the palace. Their prayers joined the chorus in the temples. Their faith gave strength to his rule. Without their devotion, the throne would be hollow. From the high windows of his palace, the pharaoh sometimes looked out upon his people. He saw children playing in dusty streets, women carrying jars of water upon their heads, men calling out to one another across the fields. These sights reminded him of his duty, not only to the gods above, but to the lives that depended upon his wisdom. The harmony of Egypt rested on this bond. The people worked the land, the Nile gave its blessing, and the pharaoh maintained the balance of Ma'at, the sacred order of life. Within the palace walls, the sound of laughter often echoed through courtyards and gardens. These were the voices of the pharaoh's children, heirs to the throne and guardians of the future. They played beneath the shade of date palms, chasing one another across tiled floors, their sandals clicking softly against stone. Tutors guided their education, teaching them to read hieroglyphs, to count grain, to understand the stars. Priests instructed them in sacred rites, whispering the names of gods and the stories of creation. Warriors trained the young princes in archery and chariot driving, while princesses learned the arts of music, poetry, and healing. The pharaoh watched them with pride, sometimes joining their games, sometimes simply observing. To him, they were both joy and responsibility. His bloodline must remain strong, for the stability of Egypt depended on a clear heir to the throne. Yet beyond duty, there was tenderness. In quiet evenings, he held his youngest child upon his knee, telling stories of gods and heroes, his voice gentle, his gaze softened. For though the world saw him as divine, within these moments he was only a father.
Beside the pharaoh stood the great royal wife, the Queen of Egypt. She was not merely a companion, but a partner in power, her presence vital in the harmony of the court. Adorned with jewels and linen as fine as the pharaoh's own, she walked with grace through the palace, her influence woven quietly into every corner of life. The queen oversaw the inner workings of the palace, guiding the women who spun linen, prepared food, and cared for the children.
She held audiences of her own, listening to petitions from the women of Egypt who sought justice and aid. She was also a priestess, standing beside the pharaoh in rituals, pouring offerings to the gods, and chanting prayers that kept Egypt in balance. In festivals, her image was carved upon temple walls, her beauty eternalized in stone. To the pharaoh, she was confidant and counsel. In private chambers, they spoke of dreams, omens, and the burdens of rule. Her wisdom softened his edges. Her presence steadied his spirit. In the silence of the palace gardens, they sometimes walked together at dusk, hand in hand, not as king and queen, but as man and woman, two lives bound by love, duty, and eternity.
Each year, when the season was right, the festival of Opet filled the city with joy. The pharaoh, dressed in shining regalia, led the sacred procession from the temple of Amun to the temple of Luxor. Crowds gathered, their cheers rising like waves as priests carried the sacred bark, a golden shrine resting upon the shoulders of men. Musicians played drums and flutes, dancers moved with energy, and incense clouded the air with its sweet, heavy fragrance. The pharaoh rode in a chariot or sometimes walked, his steps measured, his presence radiant. To the people, this festival was a moment of closeness. They saw their king not distant in his palace, but walking among them, blessed by the gods. At the temple, rituals of renewal were performed. Offerings were made, prayers were chanted, and blessings were asked for the fertility of the land and the strength of the throne. The queen stood beside him, her presence completing the divine balance. By night, feasting filled the city. Wine flowed, bread was shared, and joy echoed beneath the stars. The festival of Opet was more than celebration. It was renewal, a reminder that Egypt lived as long as the bond between gods, king, and people remained unbroken.
Deep within the palace workshops, craftsmen bent over their work, shaping treasures that would dazzle the eyes of both mortals and gods. Gold was hammered into delicate necklaces, rings, and crowns. Precious stones were set into amulets shaped like scarabs, ankhs, and falcons, symbols of protection and eternity. The pharaoh often visited these workshops, his presence inspiring the artisans to greater perfection. He admired their skill, watching as a simple piece of metal was transformed into a symbol of divine power. Each treasure carried meaning, for nothing in Egypt was made without purpose. Jewelry was not only for beauty, it was for protection. Amulets guarded against evil, scarabs promised rebirth, and ankhs carried the breath of life. When the pharaoh wore them, he carried the power of the gods upon his body, wrapping himself in their eternal presence. These treasures also filled the tombs of kings, placed carefully beside mummies to guide them in the afterlife. For in Egypt, life and death were not opposites, they were one journey, and gold was the sun's eternal light carried into eternity. Egypt was a land of peace and order, yet beyond its borders lay deserts, rival kingdoms, and wandering tribes. To guard the land, the pharaoh commanded an army of loyal soldiers. They trained in the heat of the sun, their bodies strong, their skills sharp. Archers drew their bows with precision, spearmen formed tight ranks, and charioteers raced across the sands, their horses swift as the desert wind. The pharaoh sometimes watched their drills, his presence a reminder of the divine authority they served. To them, fighting for Egypt was more than duty, it was sacred. They believed they were defending not only land and people, but also Ma'at, the eternal order of the universe. Campaigns were rare, but necessary. When threats rose at the borders, the pharaoh led his army with courage, riding his chariot into battle, the falcon of Horus painted upon his shield. Victory brought not only safety, but glory, carved into temple walls for generations to remember. At night, soldiers camped beneath the stars, their fires glowing in the desert. They sang songs of home, of the Nile, of families waiting. And though their lives were hard, they carried pride, for they fought under the living God, the Pharaoh himself.
Within the palace, healers practiced their craft, blending wisdom of herbs with sacred incantations. Shelves held jars of honey, garlic, frankincense, and oils pressed from plants of the Nile. Their knowledge was vast, for they believed every illness was both physical and spiritual. When the pharaoh or his family fell ill, healers came with steady hands and calm voices. They crushed herbs into pastes, brewed teas, and wrapped wounds with linen strips dipped in honey's golden sweetness, known for its power to heal. Yet, alongside these remedies, priests whispered prayers, for no cure was complete without the blessing of the gods. The pharaoh trusted these men and women deeply. Their touch carried both skill and faith, their presence bringing comfort. Healing was not only for the body, but also for the soul, and the pharaoh knew that strength flowed from harmony within. At times, he walked among the healers, watching as they prepared medicines not only for royalty, but for soldiers, workers, and servants. In their hands, Egypt's life was preserved, for its kingdom was strong only when its people were well. Beyond the palace walls lay gardens fragrant with blossoms. Here, the pharaoh often strolled in the cool of evening, breathing in the scents of lotus, jasmine, and myrrh. Pools of water reflected the fading sun, and ducks glided across their surfaces, rippling the calm. Servants gathered flowers to press into oils, creating perfumes that filled the palace halls. These scents were not merely for beauty, they carried sacred meaning. Lotus symbolized rebirth, frankincense was offered to the gods, and myrrh purified the body before sacred rites. The pharaoh sometimes sat upon a stone bench, watching the gardeners work. Their hands dug into rich soil, nurturing plants with patience. Bees hummed among blossoms, their steady song blending with the rustle of palm leaves. In these gardens, the pharaoh found peace. The air was gentle, the colors soft, the fragrance sweet. Here he was not ruler of armies or judge of men. He was a soul resting in nature's eternal embrace.
Far away in the cliffs of the Valley of the Kings, artists labored quietly, painting walls meant for eternity. Their brushes, made of reeds, dipped into pots of blue, red, and gold. Upon the stone, they painted gods, stars, and scenes of the pharaoh's journey to the afterlife. Each stroke was precise, for mistakes could not be allowed. They believed that images carried power, that to paint a god was to call upon its presence. To paint the pharaoh was to give him eternal life. The pharaoh sometimes visited these sacred places, walking through the cool corridors where his tomb was being prepared. He saw himself painted offering to Osiris, sailing across the sky with Ra, standing tall before the weighing of the heart. These visions were not vanity, they were promises of eternity. The artists bowed low, yet their hearts swelled with pride. They knew their work would outlast them,
their colors glowing long after their own bones had turned to dust. And the Pharaoh, gazing at these images, felt the comfort of knowing his soul's journey would never be forgotten.
The Pharaoh's fleet rested upon the waters of the Nile, great boats carved from cedar and painted with sacred symbols. Their sails caught the wind like wings, carrying him swiftly along the river's path. He traveled often by boat, for the Nile was Egypt's great road. From Memphis to Thebes, from villages to temples, his journeys tied the kingdom together. Crowds gathered upon the banks, waving palm fronds, cheering as the golden barge of their king passed by. On deck, cushions and canopies shaded him from the sun. Musicians played softly, their melodies drifting across the water, mingling with the splash of oars. Priests carried small shrines, ensuring that even upon the river the gods were present.
In quiet chambers, scribes bent over papyrus, recording every word of the Pharaoh's reign. They wrote of victories in battle, offerings to the gods, harvests of abundance, and festivals of joy. Their pens scratched softly, yet their work was thunder in eternity. The Pharaoh sometimes entered these rooms, his steps silent upon the stone. He watched as his deeds were transformed into symbols, each line preserving his name against the erosion of time. He knew well, men may die, stones may crumble, but words once written could endure forever. Scribes also copied hymns and prayers, tales of gods and heroes, and wisdom for future kings. Their work was more than record, it was guidance, a lamp for those yet unborn. To honor them, the Pharaoh offered them gifts, for he understood that their hands carried the voice of his age. And when he left their chamber, he felt the weight of immortality pressing lightly upon his shoulders, for through their ink he would live beyond the limits of flesh.
When the day ended and silence fell over the city, the Pharaoh often stepped into his palace rooftop. The sky stretched wide above him, filled with stars that glittered like jewels upon black velvet. Priests of the stars sometimes stood beside him, pointing to constellations, the hunter, the falcon, the river in the sky. They spoke of cycles, of seasons, of the endless turning of time. The Pharaoh listened, his heart steady, for he too was part of this rhythm. The cool air touched his face, carrying the faint scent of jasmine from the gardens below. Torches flickered far in the streets, but above, the heavens glowed eternal. He thought of his ancestors, of kings whose names still burned upon temple walls, of his own children who would one day gaze at these same stars. In that silence, he felt both small and infinite, for though his reign was bound by time, Egypt itself was endless, carried forward like the Nile, flowing forever beneath the gaze of the gods. The first light of dawn stretched across the Nile, painting the horizon with hues of pink and gold. Inside the grand palace, the Pharaoh's attendants stirred to life, preparing for another sacred day. The ruler of Egypt did not awaken like an ordinary man. His mornings began with rituals meant to honor the gods and reaffirm his divine connection to the heavens. Priests entered the chamber silently, carrying incense made of myrrh and frankincense. They lit it at the edge of the Pharaoh's bedchamber, filling the air with a gentle fragrance. This smoke, they believed, purified the space, warding off evil spirits and blessing the Pharaoh's body with strength.
Soft chants echoed in the background, blending with the sound of mourning birds outside the palace walls. Once awakened, the pharaoh was bathed with water brought from the Nile itself. This was no ordinary washing. It was a symbolic act that bound him once more to the river, the lifeblood of Egypt. The water was poured over him from golden vessels, its coolness refreshing against the warmth of the rising sun. Afterward, he was dressed in linen garments of the finest weave, whiter than the sands of the desert. Jewelry of gold and turquoise was carefully placed upon him, a broad collar, bracelets, and the signet ring that bore his name. Each item carried power and meaning, protecting him as much as they adorned him. Before taking any meal, the pharaoh offered his first words of the day to the gods. Standing before a small altar within the palace, he whispered prayers to Ra, the sun god, thanking him for the dawn and for the chance to rule once more under divine light. Only then did the ruler of Egypt proceed to break his fast with bread, figs, and a sip of honeyed beer, ready to step into the duties of kingship.
As the golden light of the sun began to fade, casting long shadows across the Nile, the palace prepared for the quiet hours of the night. The pharaoh, having completed his duties of state and ceremony, withdrew into a more private world, one filled with reflection and calm. Evening was not merely rest, it was a time to reconnect with the gods and with the eternal rhythm of the land. Inside a chamber, softly lit by oil lamps, priests brought offerings of bread, dates, and wine to a small shrine. These were placed before statues of the gods, ensuring that Egypt remained in divine favor through the night. The pharaoh would join in this ritual, his voice calm and steady as he recited hymns to Ra, who was now sinking into the underworld, and to Osiris, Lord of Eternity, who would guard the kingdom until dawn. After the rituals, musicians entered the hall. The sound of harps and flutes filled the air, weaving melodies as soft as the flowing river. The pharaoh reclined on cushions while dancers performed graceful movements, their steps telling stories of creation, harvest, and victory. It was a reminder that Egypt's strength lay not only in war and monuments, but also in its art and spirit. When the entertainment ended, the pharaoh often took a moment to walk through the palace gardens. The air was cool, fragrant with lotus flowers and night-blooming jasmine. Above, the stars shone brilliantly, and the pharaoh gazed upward, seeing in their patterns the gods who watched over him. For a brief moment, even the ruler of Egypt felt himself small under the endless sky. Finally, he returned to his chamber. Surrounded by protective amulets, with sacred texts placed near his bed, the pharaoh closed his eyes. His dreams, they believed, were messages from the divine, visions guiding the fate of Egypt itself. And so another day of the pharaoh ended, flowing gently into the timeless current of history, as eternal as the Nile.
Deep within the palace, far from the bustling courtyards and ceremonial halls, there lay a chamber few were permitted to enter. This was the pharaoh's hidden library, a sanctuary of knowledge where scrolls and papyri were carefully preserved. By torchlight, scribes copied the wisdom of generations, astronomy, medicine, mathematics, hymns, and the sacred texts of the gods. The pharaoh often visited this chamber at dusk, guided only by trusted priests. Here he would sit in silence,
listening as scribes read aloud passages from ancient writings. The knowledge was not simply practical, it was divine. To understand the movements of the stars was to know the will of Ra. To study the secrets of healing was to carry the blessings of Sekhmet, goddess of medicine. Within these scrolls were instructions on building temples, curing ailments, and even interpreting dreams. For the pharaoh, this was more than study. It was communion with the ancestors, a reminder that every king was part of an eternal chain stretching back to the first rulers who were said to walk among the gods. Occasionally, the pharaoh would pause and write a note in his own hand, a rare act, for his words themselves were considered sacred. These writings were often stored in sealed chests, to be discovered only by future kings. The library, quiet and filled with the scent of papyrus and oil lamps, was a world apart from the grandeur of the throne room. It was here, in these hushed hours, that the pharaoh's mind reached beyond war and rule, searching instead for the eternal truths that guided the destiny of Egypt. As he left the chamber, he would whisper a final prayer. May this knowledge never fade. May Egypt live forever.
When the duties of the court allowed, the pharaoh often sought renewal in the sacred act of the hunt. This was not merely sport, but a ritual, an ancient tradition that bound the king to the land, proving his strength and divine favor. To hunt was to demonstrate mastery over chaos, much like the gods had conquered the forces of darkness. At dawn, the pharaoh would ride out into the desert or the lush marshes along the Nile, accompanied by chariots, hunters, and priests. Trumpets announced his presence, and the desert winds carried the sound far into the horizon. He wore not the golden crown, but a lighter headdress fit for speed and movement. His bow, carved from fine wood and inlaid with gold, gleamed under the rising sun. In the desert, wild gazelles and lions were the quarry, their capture symbolizing the pharaoh's control over the wild forces of nature. In the marshlands, hippos and crocodiles were hunted, dangerous creatures that threatened fishermen and farmers. To slay them was to protect Egypt, to act as a guardian of his people. Each kill was followed by ritual. Priests chanted hymns, praising the gods for the pharaoh's strength. The hunt was seen as a reflection of Maat, the balance of the world. By conquering the wild, the pharaoh restored harmony, just as he ruled with justice in the palace. At day's end, the pharaoh returned in triumph, his chariots filled with the spoils of the hunt. Musicians played, and courtiers cheered his return. Yet the pharaoh himself often remained silent, gazing at the horizon, for he knew that the hunt, like kingship, was not only about victory, it was about responsibility, the eternal duty to guard the land and its people.
Every year, the rhythm of life in Egypt was tied to the Nile. Its annual flood was not seen as chance, but as the heartbeat of the gods themselves. For the pharaoh, this sacred cycle was both a blessing and a responsibility. He was believed to hold power over the river, ensuring its waters rose in time and with abundance. When the flood season approached, priests would climb to the Nilometer, an ancient stone gauge carved with markings to measure the river's rise. These readings were delivered to the pharaoh, who listened in silence, for they foretold the fortunes of his people. A generous flood meant rich harvests. Too little meant famine. Too much meant destruction.
The pharaoh would then lead great ceremonies to honor Hapi, the god of the Nile. Offerings of flowers, bread, and precious stones were cast into the waters, accompanied by chants and music that echoed across the riverbanks. Farmers watched from the fields, believing that the pharaoh's prayers alone could persuade the river to bless them. During this season, the palace courtyards were filled with activity. Scribes calculated taxes based on the expected harvests, while workers prepared canals and irrigation systems to direct the floodwaters. The pharaoh oversaw it all, understanding that his rule was not measured only by monuments and victories, but by the fertility of the land. In the evenings, he often walked along the riverbanks in quiet reflection. The setting sun turned the waters golden, and the cool breeze carried the scent of wet earth. Looking at the endless flow of the river, he whispered prayers of gratitude, knowing that just as the Nile nourished Egypt, he too was bound to nourish the lives of his people.
Beneath the grand palaces and towering temples, there were chambers known only to the pharaoh and his closest priests. These hidden rooms were not for councils of war or royal feasts, but for solitude, reflection, and communion with the gods. In these sacred spaces, away from the noise of the court, the pharaoh could lay down the weight of his crown. The chamber was dimly lit by oil lamps, their flames flickering against walls painted with stars and constellations. At its center stood a simple stone altar, upon which rested offerings of incense, wine, and lotus blossoms. Here the pharaoh prayed in silence, seeking guidance from Ra, Osiris, and Thoth. Some nights he fasted, believing that in stillness and humility the voice of the divine could be heard more clearly. Scribes and artisans had no entry to these rooms, nor did guards or servants. Only the pharaoh and the high priests of Amun or Puta were allowed to descend into the chamber. They carried papyrus scrolls of hymns recited softly in ancient tones while the pharaoh knelt before the gods. These moments were not for the people to see. While Egypt saw their ruler as strong, unshaken, and eternal, within the chamber he was a man seeking balance, afraid of failure, aware of his mortality. He asked the gods for wisdom, for strength to uphold Ma'at, and for protection against the shadows of chaos. When he emerged, his face was calm, his spirit renewed. To his court, he was once more the unshakable pharaoh, but within himself he carried the memory of the sacred chamber, a place where crown and titles meant nothing, and only the bond between man and God endured.